Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get right into chapter 2 of Animal Farm. Last we met, we read chapter 1, and in that chapter, the main action of the story is that old Major, the kind of leader among the animals, the old pig, called everybody together. He'd had a dream, he's feeling inspired, and he wants to get them all motivated to rebel against human beings, because they're being exploited for their resources, and they're being worked and beaten and slaughtered, and it's just not a good thing. And remember, every time that you start like putting together the action story from the animal level, now think about what human groups we're talking about. Okay, so humans are the bad guys in this, but only a certain group of humans are the bad guys in the bigger picture that we're being told about. Now there are 3 levels. There's what's happening with the animals, what's happening in the Russian Revolution, which this is really talking about the events of as we go along, and what's happening in society in general all the time. Okay, that's really what we're talking about. It's just like if you're talking about Little Red Riding Hood. There's a little girl and a wolf and a grandma in this regular story, but then it's more talking about like when kids are growing up, following rules, staying on the chosen path, not straying away from what they've been taught to do because it's dangerous. And then there might be even some more discussions you could have about like, well, if you always stay on the chosen path, is that always a good thing? Is it worth the risk sometimes to do something differently? So you can take an allegory, you can take it in a lot of directions. So far, when we talk about Old Major, it's really important for you to note, and also important for your extra credit, that Old Major actually stands for Lenin. He was the leader of the communist movement towards the Soviet Union during the Bolshevik or Russian Revolution. Okay, so he was at first the leader that they all gathered round, that listened, or like got people listening to him. He was using the works of a man called Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. A lot of people also say that Karl Marx could be the inspiration for Old Major. Lenin would have been the guy who took up the mantle of the guy who said that communism will work for the Soviet Union, we should do this instead. The man who is in charge of the farm, Mr. Jones, would be the representative of the Tsar. A Tsar is like a king. In old Russia, the aristocracy and the royal family were the czars in their family. And this particular czar of the last czar, I guess you could say, had let things get pretty bad for the lower classes of Russia. Basically, if you were rich and connected to nobility, either working for them, with them, or in the political system some way, your life was pretty good. All the best vodka, all the money, all the wealth and the beautiful things, and it was just a lovely lifestyle for the rich and famous. If you were a peasant, if you were in the lower classes, then you were like the animals said, they everything they did was for somebody else. They didn't get to keep anything for themselves. They didn't own anything. They just worked and they worked and they worked, and they weren't taken care of. This was just after the Industrial Revolution, basically, and people working in factories, and they didn't even barely get enough money to survive, much less any enjoyment out of their labor, right? So that's kind of important to note. And there were it wasn't much of a middle class. There were something called the bureaucracy, people who just worked for the political system, and so they're dependent on it. If that political system didn't do well, then they wouldn't do well either. So we'll run into a couple characters that kind of represent that as well. Okay, so I got to get my phone to come back up with the text on it. Once again, I am reading Animal Farm in its entirety on my phone because it is always available to you if you need it. Okay. I sent you a one that you can write on, though, which I think is really actually handy, because if you come into a spot that you don't understand something and I'm not explaining it, underline or highlight, you can go back and check on some definitions for the words and really process it when you need to. All right, chapter 2. 3 nights later, Old Major died peacefully in his sleep. His body was buried at the foot of the orchard. This was early in March. During the next 3 months, there was much secret activity. Major's speech had given to the more intelligent animals on the farm a completely new outlook on life. They did not know when the rebellion predicted by Major would take place. They had no reason for thinking that it would be within their own lifetime, but they saw clearly that it was their duty to prepare for it. The work of teaching and organizing the others fell naturally upon the pigs, who were generally recognized as being the cleverest of the animals. Preeminent among the pigs were two young boars named Snowball and Napoleon, whom Mr. Jones was breeding up for sale. Napoleon was a large, rather fierce-looking Berkshire boar, the only Berkshire on the farm, not much of a talker, but with a reputation for getting his own way. Snowball was a more vivacious pig than Napoleon, quicker in speech and more inventive, but was not considered to have the same depth of character. All the other male pigs on the farm were porkers. The best known among them was a small fat pig named Squealer, with very round cheeks, twinkling eyes, nimble movements, and a shrill voice. He was a brilliant talker, and when he was arguing some difficult point, he had a way of skipping from side to side and whisking his tail, which was somehow very persuasive. The others said of Squealer that he could turn black into white. These three had elaborated Old Major's teachings into a complete system of thought to which they gave the name of Animalism. Several nights a week after Mr. Jones was asleep, they held secret meetings in the barn and expounded the principles of animalism to the others. At the beginning, they met with much stupidity and apathy. Some of the animals talked of the duty of loyalty to Mr. Jones, whom they referred to as Master, or made elementary remarks such as, "Mr. Jones feeds us. If he were gone, we should starve to death." Others asked such questions as, "Why should we care what happens after we are dead?" Or, "If this rebellion is to happen anyway, what difference does it make whether we work for it or not?" And the pigs had a great difficulty in making them see that this was contrary to the spirit of animalism. The stupidest questions of all were asked by Molly, the white mare. The very first question she asked Snowball was, "Will there still be sugar after the rebellion?" "No," said Snowball firmly. "We have no means of making sugar on this farm. Besides, you do not need sugar. You have all the oats and hay you want." "And shall I still be allowed to wear ribbons in my mane?" asked Molly. "Comrade," said Snowball, "those ribbons that you are so devoted to are the badge of slavery. Can you not understand that liberty is worth more than ribbons?" Molly agreed, but she did not sound very convinced. The pigs had an even harder struggle to counteract the lies put about by Moses, the tame raven. Moses, who was Mr. Jones's especial pet, was a spy and a tale-bearer, but he was also a clever talker. He claimed to know of the existence of a mysterious country called Sugar Candy Mountain, to which all animals went when they died. It was situated somewhere up in the sky, a little distance beyond the clouds, Moses said. In Sugar Candy Mountain, it was Sunday 7 days a week. Clover was in season all the year round, and lump sugar and linseed cake grew on the hedges. The animals hated Moses because he told tales and did no work, but some of them believed in Sugar Candy Mountain, and the pigs had to argue very hard to persuade them that there was no such place. Their most faithful disciples were the two cart horses, Boxer and Clover. These two had great difficulty in thinking anything out for themselves, but having once accepted the pigs as their teachers, they absorbed everything that they were told and passed it on to the other animals by simple arguments. They were unfailing in their attendance at the secret meetings in the barn and led the singing of Beasts of England, with which the meetings always ended. Now, as it turned out, the rebellion was achieved much earlier and more easily than anyone had expected. In past years, Mr. Jones, although a hard master, had been a capable farmer. But of late, he had fallen on evil days. He had become much disheartened after losing money in a lawsuit, and had taken to drinking more than was good for him. For whole days at a time, he would lounge in his Windsor chair in the kitchen, reading the newspapers, drinking, and occasionally feeding Moses on crusts of bread soaked in beer. His men were idle and dishonest. The fields were full of weeds, the buildings wanted roofing, the hedges were neglected, and the animals were underfed. June came, and the hay was almost ready for cutting. On Midsummer's Eve, which was a Saturday, Mr. Jones went into Willingdon and got so drunk at the Red Lion that he did not come back till midday on Sunday. The men had milked the cows in the early morning and then had gone out rabbiting without bothering to feed the animals. When Mr. Jones got back, he immediately went to sleep on the drawing-room sofa with the news of the world over his face, so that when evening came, the animals were still unfed. At last, they could stand it no longer. One of the cows broke in the door of the store shed with her horn, and all the animals began to help themselves from the bins. It was just then that Mr. Jones woke up. The next moment, he and his 4 men were in the store shed with whips in their hands, lashing out in all directions. This was more than the hungry animals could bear. With one accord, though nothing of the kind had been planned beforehand, they flung themselves upon their tormentors. Jones and his men suddenly found themselves being butted and kicked from all sides. The situation was quite out of their control. They had never seen animals behave like this before, And this sudden uprising of creatures whom they were used to thrashing and maltreating, just as they chose, frightened them almost out of their wits. After only a moment or two, they gave up trying to defend themselves and took to their heels. A minute later, all 5 of them were in full flight down the cart track that led to the main road, with the animals pursuing them in triumph. Mrs. Jones looked out of the bedroom window, saw what was happening, hurriedly flung a few possessions into a carpetbag, and slipped out of the farm by another way. Moses sprang off his perch and flapped after her, croaking loudly. Meanwhile, the animals had chased Jones and his men out onto the road and slammed the 5-barred gate behind them. And so, almost before they knew what was happening, the rebellion had been successfully carried through. Jones was expelled, and the Manor farm was theirs. For the first few minutes, the animals could hardly believe in their good fortune. Their first act was to gallop in a body right around the boundaries of the farm, as though to make quite sure that no human being was hiding anywhere upon it. Then they raced back to the farm buildings to wipe out the last traces of Jones's hated reign. The harness room at the end of the stables was broken into. The bits, the nose rings, the dog chains, the cruel knives with which Mr. Jones had been used to castrate the pigs and lambs were all flung down the well. The reins, the halters, the blinkers, the degrading nose bags were thrown onto the rubbish fire which was burning in the yard. So were the whips. All the animals capered with joy when they saw the whips going up in flames. Snowball also threw onto the fire the ribbons with which the horses' manes and tails had usually been decorated on market days. Ribbons, he said, should be considered as clothes, which are the mark of a human being. All animals should go naked. When Boxer heard this, he fetched the small straw hat which he wore in summer to keep the flies out of his ears, and flung it on the fire with the rest. In a very little while, the animals had destroyed everything that reminded them of Mr. Jones. Napoleon then led them back to the store shed and served out a double ration of corn to everybody, with 2 biscuits for each dog. Then they sang Beasts of England from end to end 7 times running, and after that they settled down for the night and slept as they had never slept before. But they woke at dawn as usual, and suddenly remembering the glorious thing that had happened, they all raced out into the pasture together. A little way down the pasture there was a knoll that commanded a view of most of the farm. The animals rushed to the top of it and gazed around them in the clear morning light. Yes, it was theirs. Everything that they could see was theirs. In the ecstasy of that thought, they gamboled around, round and round. They hurled themselves into the air in great leaps of excitement. They rolled in the dew. They cropped mouthfuls of the sweet summer grass. They kicked up clods of the black earth and snuffed its rich scent. Then they made a tour of inspection of the whole farm and surveyed with speechless admiration the plowland, the hayfield, the orchard, the pool, the spinney. It was as though they had never seen these things before, and even now they could hardly believe that it was all their own. Then they filed back to the farm buildings and halted in silence outside the door of the farmhouse. That was theirs too, but they were frightened to go inside. After a moment, however, Snowball and Napoleon butted the door open with their shoulders, and the animals entered in single file, walking with utmost care for fear of disturbing anything. They tiptoed from room to room, afraid to speak above a whisper, and gazing with a kind of awe at the unbelievable luxury, at the beds with their feather mattresses, the looking glasses, the horsehair sofa, the Brussels carpet, the lithograph of Queen Victoria over the drawing room mantelpiece. They were just coming down the stairs when Molly was discovered to be missing. Going back, the others found that she had remained behind in the best bedroom. She had taken a piece of blue ribbon from Mrs. Jones's dressing table and was holding it against her shoulder and admiring herself in the glass in a very foolish manner. The others reproached her sharply, and they went outside. Some hams hanging in the kitchen were taken out for burial, and the barrel of beer in the scullery was stove in with a kick from Boxer's hoof. Otherwise, nothing in the house was touched. A unanimous resolution was passed on the spot that the farmhouse should be preserved as a museum. All were agreed that no animal must ever live there. The animals had their breakfast, and then Snowball and Napoleon called them together again. "Comrades," said Snowball, "it is 6:30, and we have a long day before us. Today we begin the hay harvest, but there is another matter that must be attended to first." The pigs now revealed that during the past 3 months, they had taught themselves to read and write from an old spelling book which had belonged to Mr. Jones's children and which had been thrown on the rubbish heap. Napoleon sent for pots of black and white paint, and led the way down to the 5-barred gate that gave on to the main road. Then Snowball, for it was Snowball who was best at riding, took a brush between the 2 knuckles of his trotter, painted out Manor Farm from the top bar of the gate, and in its place painted Animal Farm. This was to be the name of the farm from now onwards. After this, they went back to the farm buildings, where Snowball and Napoleon sent for a ladder, which they caused to be set against the end wall of the big barn. They explained that by their studies of the past 3 months, the pigs had succeeded in reducing the principles of animalism to 7 commandments. These 7 commandments would now be inscribed on the wall. They would form an unalterable law by which all the animals on Animal Farm must live forever after. With some difficulty, for it is not easy for a pig to balance himself on a ladder, Snowball climbed up and set to work, with Squealer a few rungs below him holding the paint pot. The commandments were written on the tarred wall in great white letters that could be read 30 yards away. They ran thus: the 7 commandments. 1. Whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy. 2. Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend. 3. No animal shall wear clothes. 4. No animal shall sleep in a bed. 5. No animal shall drink alcohol. 6. No animal shall kill any other animal. 7. All animals are equal. It was very neatly written, and except that friend was written friend, E before I, and one of the S's was the wrong way around, the spelling was correct all the way through. Snowball read it aloud for the benefit of the others. All the animals nodded in complete agreement, and the cleverer ones at once began to learn the commandments by heart. Now, comrades, cried Snowball, throwing down the paintbrush, to the hayfield. Let us make it a point of honor to get in the harvest more quickly than Jones and his men could do. But at this moment, the 3 cows, who had seemed uneasy for some time past, set up a loud lowing. They had not been milked for 24 hours, and their udders were almost bursting. After a little thought, the pigs sent for buckets and milked the cows fairly successfully, their trotters being well adapted to this task. Soon there were 5 buckets of frothing, creamy milk, at which many of the animals looked with considerable interest. What is going to happen to all that milk? Said someone. Jones used sometimes to mix some of it in our mash, said one of the hens. Never mind the milk, comrades, cried Napoleon, placing himself in front of the buckets. That will be attended to. The harvest is more important. Comrade Snowball will lead the way. I shall follow in a few minutes. Forward, comrades, the hay is waiting. So the animals trooped down the hayfield to begin the harvest, and when they came back in the evening, it was noticed that the milk had disappeared. Okay, a lot happens in chapter 2. Let's go to our questions. The first one that we need to answer here is number 5. Moses is an allegory for a certain kind of human leader. What do you think he symbolizes? Well, we know that Moses is tamed by humans. So he hangs out with humans and even leaves when the humans leave. He tells the animals that after they die, they can go to a place called Sugar Candy Mountain, which is in the sky. So that should tell you a little bit about what he's talking about. He's an allegory for somebody who might tell you about heaven. Who would that be? Now, don't think about just a human or a person. Think about a social institution. So Moses is an allegory for the institution that tells people that if they work hard and they just, behave, then they will go to heaven. And the animals didn't all believe or like him because he seemed to be always, doing what he was told by the leaders, the government. So they distrusted him. But the talk about this Sugar Candy Mountain, this heaven place, made people really go, yeah, I like that. I like that part. And so this relates a lot to what George Orwell, he was not a big believer in religion, and not because he didn't believe in God. I don't know if he did or not, but because he didn't like the institutions using people or allowing people to be downtrodden and poor and not doing more about that, like not being tools of the government that oppressed people. in many countries, the government is in control of the church and doesn't do a heck of a lot to make sure that the people in the country are well cared for. And so Orwell is talking about that, like this church that worked for the government only told the people that they needed to work hard and behave so they could go to heaven one day. And that's kind of cruel when they're being overworked and underfed. Okay. And so there's the allegory of the church in there. So make sure when you write that in, that's what Old Major stands for. Why is the rebellion successful? Well, you can think about it a little bit. I think it really the biggest thing is the surprise. Jones and his men didn't see it coming. Now they messed up. They were taking care of the animals, but they didn't know that behind the scenes the animals were all discussing rebellion already and trying to get ready for it. So when the animals were hungry and frustrated and they broke the rules, and then the men came in with whips, well, they already have the seed planted that they shouldn't want to do what these people say. And so they had the element of surprise by fighting back so aggressively and so fast. It was done quickly. So the allegory for the reality of it is that there were a lot of people working toward the Russian Revolution, and they were really sowing the dissent. Like the people, the masses were hearing the teachings of communism and how it would be a better life for everybody, and we need to fight off the Tsar and his people. We have to get rid of our current style of government. It was all like in their heads. And so when the opportunity arose, there was a terrible bloody attack against the Tsar and his family. As a matter of fact, the Tsar and his family were all killed. And it would just happen so quickly. Suddenly, oh, hey, dang, we won? Suddenly they were in charge and they had to figure out how to run the country. And that's what's happening with the animals now. What are the 7 rules of conduct, and why do you think these were chosen? So let's go back to the text for that. Because this is going to come up many times later. So these are called the 7 commandments. The 2 legs is an enemy, 4 legs or wings is a friend. Animals can't wear clothes, sleep in beds, drink alcohol. It's very human activities. You don't want to be like them. And then don't kill another animal. And all animals are equal, being the final summary of it. Well, these were chosen because these were things that were mentioned in the discussion that Old Major first brought up. The first 2 clarify who's on their side and who they need to count as an enemy from the outset. The ones that keep them from doing human-like things are supposedly, I would think, to keep them from doing human-like actions towards one another. Those are things that lead to trying to be better than your coworkers, I guess. And the don't kill each other piece would be like, that would just weaken their the bind of their comradeship. They all have to treat each other well. And finally, all animals are equal. Right? That doesn't sound terrible. I mean, no, turn these around. So they're about people. So people like us are our friends. People like them are our enemies. The clothes would stand for like kind of the wealth. The bed would be the luxury. The alcohol would be the being allowed to be off task and irresponsible, because the Tsar's folks partied a lot, and it was almost like an insult to the poor people of that country that they would have all this luxury, all this laziness, all this ridiculous excess was what really hurt the people. Like, how could you do that when we're starving and working so hard? So those are the things that kind of symbolize that bad behavior. Okay. And then the killing each other, they'll just kill people, and and then everybody's equal. And I think we like to believe that in our country, that all people are equal. But are they? I mean, that's a great topic for discussion. Is everybody equal? Does everybody have the right to the same things? Something to think about. All right. I think we'll let the rest go for the next chapter. We can start to answer questions about how the pigs resemble human revolutionary leaders a little bit in this one, but we might want to look back at it again. They teach themselves the philosophy behind things. They put together the ideas, the commandments, the the understanding of the philosophy. They put the ideas out there so that the people act upon the ideas and become part of the rebellion. So they're thought leaders. They're not just military leaders. They're people who place the thoughts out there for people to understand. So the pigs were clever and they learned to read and write. So the leaders of the revolution were intellectual and they learned about the philosophies and they spread those philosophies. And so that's one thing that you can think of as them resembling it. Okay, and we didn't know, at least this one here, how do animals feel about the revolution? First thing, they're giddy. They run around celebrating. They have such a good time. They're so proud and they're so happy that it's their place. Everybody's having a great time. Okay. All right, that's chapter 2. See you next time for chapter 3.